Nothing hurts more than being laughed at for following your heart when everyone else thinks you're a fool. Jacob Miller knew that pain well, as his neighbors mocked him for dragging home what they called a worthless, rotting boat. The 70-year-old Amish farmer had spent his whole life being different, living simple while others chased modern ways. People shook their heads when they saw him working on that old green boat in his barn, scraping away years of decay with his worn hands. They called it junk, a waste of time, another sign that old Jacob had lost his way. But something deep inside told him this boat was meant for him. As he worked, he found hidden compartments filled with old maps and artifacts. What he discovered was worth over $100 million. The question wasn't about the money, though. Would Jacob choose riches that could change his life forever, or would he stay true to the values that had always guided him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a gentle embrace, wrapping Jacob Miller's modest farm in the kind of peace that only comes with decades of simple living. At 70 years old, Jacob had risen before dawn every day for more years than most people had been alive. His calloused hands already reaching for his father's old wood, plain before his feet touched the cold hardwood floor. The tool felt familiar in his weathered grip, smooth maple handle worn to perfection by 3 generations of Miller men. His father had carved it by hand in 1943, the year before Jacob was born, and every nick and scratch told a story of honest work and quiet dedication. Jacob ran his thumb along the blade's edge, testing its sharpness with the kind of reverence most people reserved for prayer. Another early morning. "Old friend," he whispered to the tool, his breath visible in the cool air of their small bedroom. Sarah stirred beneath the handmade quilt her mother had stitched 47 years ago for their wedding, but she didn't wake. After 5 decades of marriage, she'd learned to let her husband have these quiet moments before the world demanded his attention. Jacob dressed in the same style of clothes he'd worn since boyhood, dark trousers held up by suspenders, a plain white shirt and sturdy boots that had been resoled 4 times. He moved through their simple home with the careful steps of a man who understood that every floorboard had its own voice, every door its own personality. The kitchen still held the faint smell of last night's beef stew, and Jacob smiled as he remembered how Sarah had fretted that it wasn't seasoned properly. 47 years of worrying about the salt, he murmured, lighting the oil lamp that cast dancing shadows across the hand-hewn walls. And 47 years of perfect meals. Outside the barn waited in the pre-dawn darkness like an old companion. Jacob had built it himself in 1978, using timber from trees that had grown on his grandfather's land. Every beam had been selected with care, every joint fitted with the precision that came from understanding wood as a living thing rather than just material. The structure had weathered countless storms, sheltered 3 generations of livestock, and now housed the project that had set the entire community talking. The boat sat in the center of the barn, like a green monument to folly, at least according to everyone who'd seen it. 24 feet of rotting wood and rusted hardware that most sensible people would have chopped up for kindling months ago. But Jacob saw something different when he looked at those weathered planks. He saw potential. He saw purpose. He saw a vessel that had once carried dreams across unknown waters. "Morning, old girl," he said, running his hand along the boat's cracked hull. "Let's see what secrets you're ready to share today." The ridicule had started the day he'd accepted the boat from Edgar Stoltzfus, whose property adjoined the Miller farm to the south. Edgar had inherited it from a distant relative who died intestate, and he'd been trying to get rid of the eyesore for months. When Jacob offered to take it off his hands, Edgar had actually laughed. "You sure about this, Jacob? Thing's been sitting in my field for 3 years. Might be older than both of us put together. Age doesn't always mean worthless," Jacob had replied, though he couldn't explain why he felt drawn to the deteriorating vessel. The neighbors had been less kind. Thomas Brennan, who ran the general store in town and fancied himself an authority on most subjects, had made sure everyone within 5 miles knew about Jacob's latest fool notion. "Man's lost his mind," Thomas had declared to anyone who'd listen. 70 years old and dragging home garbage like some kind of pack rat. Sarah should talk sense into him before he embarrasses himself further. But Sarah had surprised Jacob by defending his decision, even though she clearly didn't understand it herself. "If my husband sees something worth saving in that boat, then I trust his judgment," she told the church ladies after Sunday service. "Jacob Miller has never been wrong about wood, and I don't expect him to start now." The comment had only fueled more speculation. Some wondered if Jacob was going through what the English called a midlife crisis, though at 70 it seemed a bit late for that. Others suggested he was simply getting stubborn in his old age, clinging to projects that made no practical sense. A few worried that the stress of their financial struggles was affecting his thinking. The Miller farm had been losing money for 3 years running. The cost of feed kept rising, while the prices for their modest crops stayed flat. Their 2 grown children, Daniel and Rebecca, had moved to other communities where work was more plentiful. Daniel had a carpentry business in Ohio, while Rebecca had married a blacksmith in Indiana. They wrote letters and visited when they could. But Jacob and Sarah were largely on their own. The isolation might have been easier to bear if it weren't for the constant reminders of their precarious situation. The roof needed new shingles. The fence posts along the south pasture were rotting. Their old plowhorse, Clyde, was showing his age and would need to be replaced soon. Each problem represented money they didn't have, decisions they couldn't afford to make. "We could sell the back 40 acres, Sarah had suggested more than once. "The Yodas have been asking about it for years." But Jacob couldn't bring himself to part with land that had been in his family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had cleared those fields with his own hands, pulling stumps and picking rocks until his back was permanently bent. Every acre held memories. Every fence row told stories of men who'd worked themselves old before their time to build something lasting. "Land is the only thing they're not making more of," Jacob would say whenever the subject came up. "Once it's gone forever." So instead of selling, they'd tightened their belts and found ways to make do with less. Sarah had taken in sewing from English customers in town. Jacob had started making furniture during the slow winter months, his skilled hands crafting tables and chairs that sold well enough to keep them afloat. It wasn't prosperity, but it was survival, and that had always been enough for the Millers, until the boat arrived and changed everything. Jacob lit the kerosene lantern that hung from the barn's main beam and surveyed his work area. He'd cleared a space around the boat and set up a proper workshop with all the tools he'd need for the restoration. His father's wood plane sat in a place of honor on the workbench, surrounded by chisels, rasps, and sandpaper of various grits. The familiar smell of sawdust and linseed oil filled the air, mixing with the earthier scents of hay and animal feed from the other end of the barn. The boat itself was a study in neglect and abandonment. Green paint peeled from its hull in long strips, revealing wood that ranged from solid to nearly rotten, depending on how much weather it had endured. The interior was filled with decades of debris, leaves, small animal nests, and the kind of accumulated grime that spoke of years spent forgotten in some forgotten corner of someone's property. But underneath the decay, Jacob could see the craftsmanship. Someone had built this boat with care and skill, using techniques that were already old when Jacob was young. The joints were fitted with precision, the curves of the hull flowing with the kind of grace that only came from understanding how wood wanted to move through water. It was the work of a master shipbuilder, someone who'd learned their trade when boats were still built by hand, rather than stamped out in factories. "You weren't always neglected, were you?" Jacob asked, running his fingers along a section where the original wood showed through. "Someone loved you once. Someone took pride in making you beautiful. The restoration would take months, maybe longer. Jacob would have to replace at least a third of the planking, rebuild the interior seating, and completely overhaul the rigging. It was a project that would consume countless hours and cost more money than they could really afford. But something about the boat called to him in a way he couldn't explain, as if it were meant to be here, in his barn, meant to be given a second chance at life. As the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the barn's east window, Jacob picked up his father's plane and approached the boat's starboard side. The wood was soft with rot in places, but there were sections that remained solid and strong. He began to work, the familiar motion of the plane creating long curled shavings that fell to the barn floor. Like wooden snow, the rhythmic scraping sound was almost meditative, and Jacob found his mind wandering to memories of his father, teaching him this same technique more than 60 years ago. "Feel the wood," his father had said. "Listen to what it tells you. Every piece has its own personality, its own way of wanting to be shaped. Your job isn't to force it into something it doesn't want to be. Your job is to help it become what it was always meant to become." Jacob had carried that lesson through decades of carpentry work, and it had never steered him wrong. Wood was honest in a way that people sometimes weren't. It told you its history through its grain, revealed its strength through its weight, showed its age through its color and texture. If you knew how to listen, it would teach you everything you needed to know, and this boat had stories to tell. 3 weeks into the restoration, Jacob discovered that the boat held more than just memories. He'd been working on the port side hull, carefully removing a section of planking that had rotted beyond saving, when his chisel struck something that didn't sound like wood. The metallic ring echoed through the barn, causing Bessie, their old milk cow, to look up from her hay with mild curiosity. Jacob set down his tools and examined the area more closely. What he'd assumed was solid framing timber wasn't solid at all. It was hollow, and something was rattling inside. His heart began to beat faster as he realized he'd found what appeared to be a deliberately constructed hiding place. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, running his fingers along the edges of what was clearly a removable panel. The craftsmanship was so skillful that it had taken weeks of close work to notice the seams. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this secret compartment, and Jacob had the distinct feeling he was about to discover why. The panel came away with gentle pressure, revealing a cavity lined with oiled leather that had protected its contents from decades of moisture and decay. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be waxed cloth, Jacob found a brass maritime compass, unlike anything he'd ever seen. The instrument was heavy in his hands, its brass case darkened with age, but still solid and beautifully crafted. Intricate engravings covered the surface, ships and anchors, compass roses and maritime symbols that spoke of long voyages and distant shores. The needle still moved freely, pointing steadily north with the reliability of a well-made instrument. But it was the inscription around the base that made Jacob's breath catch. E. Hartwell, Master of the Seas, 1847. The letters were deeply etched and filled with what looked like silver, creating an elegant script that had survived more than a century and a half. Jacob turned the compass over in his weathered hands, discovering that the back bore an even more intriguing inscription: "For my safe return to those who matter most." The words were in the same elegant script, but they carried an emotional weight that made Jacob's chest tighten with unexpected empathy. "Someone was trying to find their way home," he said softly, understanding in that moment that this boat represented much more than transportation. It was a vessel of hope, carrying dreams of reunion and redemption. The compass wasn't the only treasure hidden in the compartment. Beneath it, Jacob found several pieces of aged parchment that had been carefully folded and wrapped in oiled silk. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the first document, revealing what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the eastern seaboard. The map showed incredible detail, marking not just major ports and cities, but smaller coves and inlets that most modern maps ignored. Notations in the same elegant handwriting marked specific locations with symbols that Jacob didn't recognize, but that clearly held significance for whoever had created this chart. Numbers were scattered across the map, Coordinates, perhaps, or measurements of some kind, but it was the second document that made Jacob sink onto his workbench stool in amazement. It appeared to be a ship's manifest or cargo list, written in the same careful hand as the compass inscription. The items listed read like an inventory of dreams. 12 cases finest China silk, 8 barrels Spanish silver coins, 4 crates carved ivory from African ports, 10 bundles rare spices from Orient markets. The list went on for 2 full pages, describing cargo that would have been worth a fortune even in 1847. At the bottom of the manifest, in slightly different ink, someone had written, "Hidden until safe return, E.H." Jacob sat in the quiet barn, holding documents that were older than anyone he'd ever known, and tried to process what he'd discovered. This wasn't just an old boat, it was a time capsule. A carefully preserved piece of maritime history that had somehow found its way to his modest Amish farm. The sound of the kitchen door slamming shut told him that Sarah was starting her morning chores. Soon she'd be out to collect eggs from their chickens, and she'd expect him to join her for breakfast. But how could he explain what he'd found? How could he make her understand that their rotting boat might be connected to treasures that could change their lives forever? He carefully rewrapped the documents and compass, placing them back in their hiding spot for safekeeping. The discovery was too important, too potentially valuable, to risk damaging through careless handling. But as he replaced the wooden panel, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Over breakfast, Sarah noticed his distraction immediately. "You're quieter than usual this morning," she observed, pouring coffee from the pot that had belonged to her grandmother. "Did you hurt yourself working on that boat?" Jacob hesitated, torn between his desire to share the discovery and his instinct to protect the secret until he understood its full significance. "Just thinking about the work ahead," he said finally, which wasn't entirely untrue. "That boat has more layers to it than I first realized." Sarah studied his face with the keen perception of a woman who'd been married to the same man for nearly 50 years. "Jacob Miller. You've got that look you get when you're holding something back. What aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, the sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced an early visitor. Through the kitchen window, they could see Thomas Brennan's familiar black buggy approaching, with Thomas himself looking particularly stern behind the reins. "Wonder what brings him out so early," Sarah murmured. But Jacob had a sinking feeling he already knew. Thomas knocked on their door with the kind of authoritative rapping that suggested official business. When Jacob answered, the storekeeper's expression was even more disapproving than usual. "Jacob, I've been thinking about this boat situation of yours," Thomas began without preamble. "Folks in town are starting to talk, and not in a good way. Some are wondering if you're developing an unhealthy attachment to worldly things. It's just a restoration project, Thomas. Nothing more, is it?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone. "Because Samuel Yoder mentioned seeing you carrying things into your barn yesterday. Things that looked like they might have come from inside that boat." Jacob's blood ran cold. Samuel's farm bordered theirs to the north, and the man had always been curious about his neighbor's business. If he'd seen Jacob with the compass and documents, the entire community would know about it by evening. Samuel Yoder needs to mind his own affairs. Jacob replied more sharply than he'd intended. Thomas's eyebrows rose at the uncharacteristic edge in Jacob's voice. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," the storekeeper said. "This boat is changing you, Jacob, making you secretive, defensive. These aren't the qualities we value in our community." After Thomas left, Jacob returned to the barn with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt before. The compass and documents were still safely hidden, but he knew their secret wouldn't remain safe for long. Samuel Yoder was the kind of man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. And if he'd seen enough to arouse suspicion, it would only be a matter of time before more questions were asked. Jacob removed the items from their hiding place and examined them again in the better light of full morning. The compass needle pointed steadily north, as reliable as the day it was made. The maps showed waterways and coastal features with the kind of detail that suggested intimate knowledge of every inlet and harbor. And the cargo manifest painted a picture of wealth that made Jacob's head spin. But it was something he hadn't noticed before that made his pulse quicken with genuine excitement. In the corner of the main map, almost too faint to see, someone had sketched what looked like a small boat, a boat remarkably similar to the one sitting in his barn. Beside the sketch, in letters so small he had to squint to read them, were the words, "Home waits." Jacob sank onto his workbench, the compass heavy in his hands, and wondered what kind of man E. Hartwell had been. What had driven him to hide such valuable cargo? What circumstances had prevented his safe return to those who mattered most? And most importantly, why did Jacob feel such a strong connection to this stranger from more than a century ago? As if in answer to his thoughts, a breeze stirred through the barn, rustling the papers in his hands and causing the boat to creak softly on its supports. For a moment, Jacob could almost imagine he heard whispers of the past, voices calling across the years with stories that demanded to be told. The restoration had become something much more than a simple project. It had become a quest to uncover truth, and Jacob had the unsettling feeling that the truth might be more extraordinary than anything he'd ever imagined. The second hidden compartment revealed itself 2 days later, almost as if the boat was ready to share its secrets in measured doses. Jacob had been working on the starboard gunwale, replacing a section of rotted wood, when his saw blade caught on what felt like a metal hinge. Further investigation revealed another expertly concealed panel, this one larger than the first and containing what appeared to be the boat's most important treasure. The leather-bound ledger was thick as a family Bible and just as carefully preserved. Its cover bore the embossed image of a 3-masted ship under full sail with Hartwell Maritime Enterprises inscribed in fading gold letters beneath. The leather was dark with age but still supple, suggesting that whoever had hidden it had taken great care to protect it from the elements. Jacob opened the ledger with the reverence he usually reserved for scripture, and found himself looking at pages of meticulous record-keeping that spanned several decades of maritime commerce. The entries began in 1843 and continued through 1869, each transaction recorded in the same elegant handwriting he'd seen on the compass and maps. But these weren't simple cargo manifests. They were the detailed records of what appeared to be a shipping empire that had operated from Boston to Charleston, with routes extending to ports in the Caribbean and beyond. Hartwell hadn't just been a ship owner. He'd been a merchant prince whose vessels had carried everything from southern cotton to oriental spices, from European manufactured goods to exotic treasures from distant lands. The financial figures made Jacob's eyes widen in disbelief. Individual shipments were valued in tens of thousands of dollars, and this was in 1840s currency, when a man could live well on $500 a year. Page after page documented transactions that represented wealth on a scale Jacob could barely comprehend. "Sarah," he called softly toward the house, then thought better of it. How could he explain what he was discovering without sounding like he'd lost his mind? A rotting boat in their barn, containing evidence of a fortune that would dwarf the combined wealth of their entire community. Instead, he continued reading, becoming increasingly absorbed in the story the ledger told. E. Hartwell had been methodical in his record-keeping, noting not just cargo and destinations, but also weather conditions, crew performance, and various business relationships. The picture that emerged was of a shrewd but apparently honest businessman who'd built his empire through careful planning and calculated risks. But as Jacob read deeper into the ledger, he began to notice troubling changes in the tone of the entries. Starting around 1865, Hartwell's neat handwriting began to show signs of stress. Transactions became more secretive, with cryptic references to special cargo and private arrangements. Several entries mentioned problems with competitors and hostile parties without providing specific details. By 1868, the entries had become almost coded, using symbols and abbreviations that Jacob couldn't decipher. But one phrase appeared repeatedly: sanctuary preparation. Hartwell had been planning something. preparing for some kind of retreat or escape that required moving valuable assets to secure locations. The final entries were the most intriguing. In what appeared to be Hartwell's last written record, dated September 15th, 1869, he wrote, "Assets secured according to plan. Maps and records hidden aboard vessel. If Providence wills my safe return, all shall be restored. If not, may the finder prove worthy of the trust." Jacob sat back on his stool, the ledger heavy in his lap, and tried to process the implications of what he'd read. Hartwell had deliberately hidden his records aboard this boat, along with maps showing where his fortune was concealed. The man had been planning for the possibility that he might not survive whatever crisis had threatened his empire. The sound of young voices outside the barn interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he could see Timothy Byler approaching with his usual morning enthusiasm. At 15, Timothy was the kind of boy who found wonder in everything, and he'd been fascinated by Jacob's restoration project from the beginning. Unlike most adults in the community, Timothy saw possibility rather than foolishness in the old boat. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Timothy called as he entered the barn. "How's the work progressing today?" Jacob quickly closed the ledger and set it aside, but not before Timothy's sharp eyes noticed the unusual book. "What's that?" "It looks old," the boy observed with the curiosity that made him such good company. Jacob hesitated, then made a decision that would change both their lives. "Timothy, can you keep a secret? I mean a truly important secret that could affect many people." The boy's eyes widened with excitement and responsibility in equal measure. "Yes, sir." "You can trust me." Jacob showed him the ledger and compass, watching as Timothy's expression shifted from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. "This boat belonged to a wealthy shipowner more than a century ago," Jacob explained. "He hid these records before disappearing, and they show where he concealed his fortune." Timothy handled the artifacts with appropriate reverence, his young mind clearly working to understand the magnitude of what they represented. "Mr. Miller, this could help so many people. Your family, our community, everyone who's struggling to make ends meet. That's what worries me," Jacob admitted. "Money changes people, Timothy. It changes communities. I've seen what the pursuit of wealth can do to good people." Over the next hour, Jacob and Timothy worked together to decipher some of the ledger's coded entries. Timothy's young eyes proved better at reading the faded ink, while Jacob's experience helped interpret the maritime terminology and business practices of the era. They discovered that Hartwell had been involved in what appeared to be perfectly legal commerce. Despite the secretive nature of his final entries, his ships had carried cotton from southern ports to northern mills, manufactured goods from Boston to southern markets, and exotic imports from foreign ports to eager American customers. The profits had been enormous, but they'd been earned through legitimate trade rather than piracy or smuggling. He was like a merchant king, Timothy marveled, reading through a particularly detailed cargo manifest. "Look at this. Silk from China, spices from India, coffee from South America." His ships traveled all over the world, but it was Timothy who made the connection that had escaped Jacob. "Mr. Miller, look at this entry from 1867. He writes about purchasing large tracts of land in Pennsylvania for future sanctuary. What if some of that land is near here? What if he chose this area specifically because he was planning to come here?" The possibility sent chills down Jacob's spine. If Hartwell had purchased land in Lancaster County, if he'd been planning to establish some kind of refuge in the very area where Jacob now lived, then the boat's arrival at his farm might not have been the coincidence it appeared to be. As the morning wore on, Jacob found himself sharing more details with Timothy than he'd intended to share with anyone. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and his questions helped Jacob think through implications he might have missed on his own. But when Sarah's dinner bell rang from the house, signaling the noon meal, Jacob was reminded of the broader consequences of his discovery. "Timothy, you understand how important it is that we keep this between us for now?" "Yes, sir. But Mr. Miller, what are you going to do with this information?" Jacob looked at the boat, then at the ledger in his hands, then at the earnest face of the young man who'd become his unlikely partner in this extraordinary mystery. "I honestly don't know, son. I truly don't know." The third compartment yielded its secret on a grey Thursday morning, when autumn's first chill had settled over Lancaster County. Jacob had been examining the boat's stern section, looking for additional rot damage, when he noticed an irregularity in what should have been solid transom wood. The discovery pattern was becoming familiar now, hidden, panels so expertly crafted that only close inspection revealed their existence. This compartment was smaller than the others, but contained what was perhaps the most personal treasure yet. Wrapped in oiled silk and nestled in a bed of cedar shavings was a silver pocket watch of extraordinary craftsmanship. The case was engraved with intricate maritime motifs, anchors, ship's wheels, and compass roses, all surrounding the initials E.H. in flowing script, but it was when Jacob opened the watch that his breath caught in his throat. The face had stopped at exactly 11:47, and engraved inside the case was an inscription that made his hands tremble. "To Ezra, may you always find your way home. All my love, Catherine." June 12, 1845. Ezra Hartwell, Jacob murmured, finally having a full name for the mysterious shipowner. But more than that, he now knew that Hartwell had been loved by someone who worried about his safe return from dangerous voyages. Timothy arrived just as Jacob was examining the watch, and the boy's excitement was immediately tempered by the solemnity of holding something so obviously precious to someone long dead. "It stopped at 11:47, Timothy observed. "I wonder if that was when something important happened to him. Or maybe when he decided to hide his treasures and disappear," Jacob suggested. "Maybe that was the moment his old life ended and his journey into uncertainty began." They spent the morning researching what they could about Ezra Hartwell, using the ledger entries to piece together a timeline of his business activities. What emerged was the portrait of a man who'd risen from modest beginnings to control a shipping empire that stretched from Maine to Georgia, with international connections that reached as far as China and India. But it was Timothy who made the breakthrough that changed everything they thought they knew about Hartwell. "Mr. Miller, look at this entry from 1843, the boy said, pointing to one of the earliest ledger pages. He writes about leaving the simple life for worldly pursuits, and mentions the community of my youth with what sounds like regret." Jacob studied the passage Timothy had found. Hartwell had written, "Today I finalized purchase of my first vessel, the Catherine's Dream, named for the woman who waits for my return to prosperity. Yet I find myself wondering if I'm trading something precious for something merely valuable. The community of my youth valued simplicity above wealth, but I have chosen the more difficult path. May God grant that I do not lose myself in the pursuit of what I believe will secure our future." "He came from a simple community," Jacob said slowly, the implications beginning to dawn on him. "A community that valued simplicity above wealth." Timothy's eyes widened. "Like an Amish community?" The possibility hung in the air between them, too enormous to fully grasp. If Ezra Hartwell had been born Amish, if he'd left the community to pursue wealth in the outside world, then his story became something far more personal and tragic than simple business success. Over the following days, Jacob found himself staying in the barn longer each morning, poring over the ledger with an intensity that worried Sarah. She began bringing his meals out to him, sitting on a hay bale while he ate, and studying his increasingly obsessed behavior with growing concern. "Jacob, you're wearing yourself thin with this project," she said one afternoon, as he barely touched the sandwich she'd prepared. "When was the last time you had a proper night's sleep?" "I'm close to understanding something important, Sarah. This boat, these records, they're telling a story that matters." Sarah set down her own sandwich and looked directly at her husband of 47 years. "Then tell me the story." "Jacob, stop shutting me out of whatever you've discovered." Jacob met her eyes and saw the hurt that his secrecy had caused. Sarah had stood by him through every challenge their life together had brought. had defended his decision to restore the boat even when she didn't understand it. She deserved to know the truth. He showed her the compass, the ledger, and the pocket watch, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to amazement to something that might have been fear. "Jacob, this is beyond anything I could have imagined," she said, holding the silver watch with the careful attention she gave to her best china. This Catherine, she loved him deeply. You can feel it in the inscription, and he loved her enough to risk everything trying to build a fortune worthy of her, Jacob replied. But somewhere along the way, he lost sight of what truly mattered. Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying the artifacts with the practical wisdom that had guided their marriage through 5 decades of challenges. "What are you planning to do with this knowledge?" she finally asked. "I don't know yet. But Sarah, if even half of what these records suggest is true, there's enough treasure hidden out there to change not just our lives, but the lives of everyone in our community. And what would that do to our community?" Sarah asked with the kind of direct question that had always kept Jacob grounded. What would that much wealth do to people who've spent their lives learning to be content with enough? Before Jacob could answer, they heard voices outside the barn. Through the window, they could see Samuel Yoder approaching with 2 other men Jacob recognized as church elders. Their expressions were stern, and Jacob realized that their secret was about to become much more complicated. Samuel knocked on the barn door with the kind of authority that came from representing the community's moral interests. "Jacob, we need to talk," he called. "There are concerns about your recent behavior that require discussion." Sarah squeezed Jacob's hand, and in her eyes he saw both support and worry in equal measure. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we face it together." Jacob carefully closed the ledger and slipped it into a feed sack, then moved the pocket watch and compass to his toolbox. The artifacts were too valuable to risk losing, but he wasn't ready to share their secret with anyone beyond Timothy and Sarah. As he opened the barn door to face whatever questions the elders might have, Jacob found himself thinking about Ezra Hartwell and the choices that had led him to hide his fortune and disappear from history. The man had gained the whole world, but apparently lost something more precious in the process. Jacob was determined not to make the same mistake. The 4th compartment changed everything. Jacob discovered it 3 days after his uncomfortable meeting with the church elders, who had questioned him about his excessive attachment to worldly projects and suggested that perhaps he was allowing pride to guide his decisions. They'd left with warnings about the spiritual dangers of pursuing material things, but Jacob knew they suspected there was more to his boat project than simple restoration. He'd been working on the forward section of the hull when his chisel revealed another hidden panel, this one sealed with what appeared to be melted wax, a more serious attempt at preservation than the others. When he finally worked the panel free, Jacob found himself staring at something that made his knees weak. A collection of gold coins that gleamed in the lantern light like captured sunlight. There were Spanish doubloons with their distinctive cross and castle design, American eagles bearing the proud image of liberty, and several coins Jacob didn't recognize, but that were clearly old and valuable. Each coin was individually wrapped in oiled cloth, and they filled a leather pouch that had been crafted specifically to hold them. But it was the note tucked beneath the pouch that made Jacob's hands tremble as he read it. Emergency provisions for Catherine's security. Value approximately $2,000 in current currency. For use only if primary caches prove inaccessible. E.H. September 1869. $2,000 in 1869 currency would be worth many times that amount today. And these coins were just what Hartwell had considered emergency money. The main fortune was still hidden somewhere else, waiting to be discovered by someone who could decipher the maps and records. Jacob sat on his workbench stool, holding wealth he'd never imagined possessing, and felt more burdened than blessed. The coins represented choices he wasn't prepared to make, responsibilities he wasn't sure he could handle. But most troubling of all, they represented tangible proof that his discovery was real. Not some elaborate fantasy his aging mind had constructed. When Timothy arrived for his usual morning visit, Jacob showed him the coins with a heavy heart rather than excitement. "Mr. Miller, this is incredible," the boy breathed, holding a Spanish doubloon up to the light. "You're holding more money than most people see in a lifetime, and that's what worries me, Timothy. This much wealth brings complications I'm not sure we're ready for." But Jacob knew he needed expert advice. Someone who could verify the coin's authenticity and value without alerting the entire community to their existence. After much internal debate, he decided to contact Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, an antique appraiser he'd heard about through English customers who'd purchased his furniture. The phone call to Dr. Morrison's office was the first time in years that Jacob had used the telephone at Brennan's General Store, and he was grateful that Thomas was busy with other customers when he made the call. Dr. Morrison agreed to meet with him privately at his farm. Intrigued by his description of some old coins that might have historical value, Dr. Morrison arrived on a crisp October afternoon, driving a modest sedan that wouldn't attract attention from curious neighbors. She was a woman in her 60s with intelligent eyes and the kind of careful manner that spoke of someone accustomed to handling valuable and fragile things. Jacob led her to the barn where he'd laid out several of the coins on a clean cloth, along with the compass and selected pages from the ledger. He'd decided to reveal part of the truth without sharing the full scope of what he'd discovered. Dr. Morrison's reaction exceeded his most optimistic expectations. "Mr. Miller, where on earth did you find these?" she asked, her professional composure cracking as she examined the Spanish doubloons through a jeweler's loupe. "These are museum-quality specimens, some of the finest examples I've seen." She spent nearly 2 hours examining and photographing the coins, making notes in a small notebook and occasionally whistling softly in appreciation. "Just based on what you've shown me here, you're looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 in value," she finally announced. "These aren't just old coins. They're pieces of American maritime history in exceptional condition." Jacob's chest tightened. $50,000 would solve every financial problem he and Sarah faced, with enough left over to help their children and make substantial improvements to the farm. But he knew this was only a small fraction of what Hartwell had hidden away. "Dr. Morrison, if these coins were part of a larger collection, say, from a 19th century shipping merchant, how would someone go about locating the rest?" She looked at him with renewed interest. "That would depend on what kinds of records or maps might exist. Wealthy merchants of that era often kept detailed documentation of their assets, especially if they were concerned about political instability or business competitors." After Dr. Morrison left with promises to research the coin's provenance discreetly, Jacob found himself pacing the barn like a caged animal. The authentication had made everything real in a way that frightened him. This wasn't an elderly man's fantasy anymore. This was a genuine treasure that could transform his family's circumstances and potentially those of his entire community. But when Sarah arrived with his afternoon coffee, she took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "The coins are real, aren't they?" she said, settling onto her usual hay bale. "That woman confirmed what you suspected. $50,000, Sarah, just from what I showed her, which was maybe a tenth of what's actually in that pouch." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at the boat that had brought such unexpected complications into their ordered life. "Jacob, I've been thinking about what you told me about this Ezra Hartwell, about how he might have come from a community like ours. What about it? What if his story is meant to be a warning rather than a promise? What if he lost everything that truly mattered in pursuit of wealth that ultimately couldn't save him?" Jacob hadn't considered that perspective, but it resonated with fears he'd been trying to ignore. "You think I should put everything back and forget we ever found it?" "I think you should pray about it," Sarah replied, with the gentle wisdom that had guided their marriage through every major decision. "And I think you should remember that every choice we make doesn't just affect us. It affects everyone we love." That evening, as Jacob sat in the barn with the gold coins spread before him like fallen stars, He found himself thinking about Ezra Hartwell's final months. The man had possessed enough wealth to live like a king, but he'd chosen to hide his fortune and disappear rather than enjoy it. What had he seen in his pursuit of riches that had ultimately driven him to abandon everything he'd worked to build? The coins gleamed in the lamplight, beautiful and tempting, and somehow ominous all at once. Jacob gathered them back into their leather pouch with hands that shook slightly, understanding for the first time that finding treasure and knowing what to do with it were two entirely different challenges. The fifth compartment revealed itself on a morning when frost painted the barn windows with delicate crystals that reminded Jacob of the intricate engravings on Hartwell's compass. He'd been working on what he'd assumed was the final section of the hull when his plane caught on yet another hidden seam. By now, the pattern was familiar, but what he found this time exceeded everything that had come before. The compartment was the largest yet, running along nearly the entire length of the boat's keel. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas and sealed with wax, Jacob discovered what appeared to be Ezra Hartwell's most precious possessions, a collection of hand-drawn maritime charts that were works of art as much as navigation tools. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing not just major shipping routes but every inlet, cove, and hidden harbor along the eastern seaboard from Maine to Georgia. But these weren't ordinary navigation charts. Scattered across the maps were symbols and notations that clearly marked specific locations where Hartwell had hidden portions of his vast fortune. Jacob spread the largest chart across his workbench, weighing down the corners with his heaviest tools. The map showed the Chesapeake Bay region in extraordinary detail, with depth soundings, tidal information, and notes about seasonal weather patterns that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of these waters. But it was the symbols that made Jacob's pulse quicken. Small anchors marked what appeared to be underwater cache sites. Tiny ships' wheels indicated locations on land, and crosses, dozens of small crosses scattered along the coastline, seemed to mark the most significant hiding places. Timothy arrived as Jacob was examining the third chart, which covered the waters around New York Harbor. "Mr. Miller, these are incredible," the boy breathed, studying the detailed coastline drawings. "He must have spent years creating these maps." "Look at this," Jacob said, pointing to a notation near what appeared to be a small island. He writes, "Silver Cache, 40 fathoms northeast of Marker Stone. Accessible only at low tide during calm weather." This isn't just a map, Timothy. It's a treasure hunter's guide. Over the next several hours, they examined all 7 charts, each one revealing more evidence of Hartwell's systematic approach to hiding his wealth. The man had created a network of carefully planned cache sites, each one documented with the precision of someone who understood that his life might depend on being able to recover these assets quickly. But it was Timothy who noticed the pattern that Jacob had missed. "Mr. Miller, look at the dates on these charts. They're not all from the same time period." Jacob studied the dates more carefully and realized Timothy was right. The earliest charts dated from 1865, but the latest ones were from 1869, the same year as Hartwell's final ledger entries. The man had spent 4 years systematically hiding his fortune, preparing for some kind of catastrophe that he'd seen coming long before it arrived. "He was planning his disappearance for years," Jacob murmured. "This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a carefully orchestrated retreat." Dr. Morrison returned the following week with news that both thrilled and terrified Jacob. Her research had confirmed not only the coin's authenticity, but had also uncovered historical records of Ezra Hartwell's shipping empire. "Mr. Miller, your Ezra Hartwell was one of the most successful maritime merchants of the mid-19th century," she explained, showing him photocopied documents from Boston's Maritime Museum. His company, Hartwell Maritime Enterprises, operated more than 30 vessels at its peak and was worth an estimated $3 million in 1869 currency. Jacob's head spun at the figures. $3 million in 1869 would be worth astronomical amounts in today's money. enough to buy entire counties. Not just farms, but here's what's really interesting, Dr. Morrison continued. There's no record of what happened to his fortune when he disappeared. His company's assets were liquidated to pay debts, but investigators at the time estimated that the majority of his personal wealth was never recovered. She paused, studying Jacob's reaction carefully. Mr. Miller, I have to ask, exactly how much material did you find in that boat? Jacob showed her the maritime charts, watching as her professional composure dissolved completely. My God, she whispered, examining the detailed notations. These aren't just maps, they're a treasure hunter's dream. If even half of these cache sites still exist, we could be talking about tens of millions of dollars in recovered assets. The number was so large that Jacob couldn't fully process it. Tens of millions of dollars! More money than existed in his entire county. Enough to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. But Dr. Morrison wasn't finished with her revelations. There's something else. Mr. Miller, according to the records I found, Ezra Hartwell wasn't born with that name. He was originally listed in some early documents as Jacob Müller, which suggests he might have been of German or Swiss origin. And there are references to him having abandoned his simple upbringing for worldly pursuits. Jacob Müller. Jacob Miller. The similarity in names hit Jacob like a physical blow. Could it be mere coincidence that a man with essentially the same name had hidden treasures that had somehow found their way to his farm? Or was there a deeper connection, something that explained why he'd felt such a strong pull toward the deteriorating boat? That evening, Jacob sat in his kitchen with Sarah, spreading the maritime charts across their dining table while she examined them with the careful attention she gave to her most complex sewing patterns. Jacob, these maps show places I recognize, she said, pointing to a section that covered the Pennsylvania coast. This inlet here, isn't that near where your grandfather used to take you fishing? Jacob studied the area she'd indicated and felt his world tilt slightly. She was right. Several of the locations marked on Hartwell's charts were in areas that had been familiar to Jacob since childhood, places where his family had fished and hunted for generations. Sarah, what if Hartwell chose this area specifically? What if he knew about our community, knew about our family? The possibility was too enormous to fully grasp, but it explained things that had puzzled Jacob from the beginning. Why had he felt such an immediate connection to the boat? Why had the restoration felt more like a calling than a simple project? As he studied the charts more closely, Jacob began to see additional evidence of Hartwell's connection to the area. Several of the land-based cache sites were marked near streams and landmarks that Jacob recognized, places that had been part of his family's history for generations. The boat hadn't found him by accident. Somehow, across more than a century and a half, Ezra Hartwell's final legacy had made its way home. The final secret compartment revealed itself on a November morning when the first snow of winter dusted the hills around Lancaster County like powdered sugar on one of Sarah's fresh-baked loaves. Jacob had been convinced he'd found all of the boat's hidden treasures. But Timothy's sharp eyes noticed something that had escaped weeks of careful examination. Mr. Miller, this board here feels different from the others, the boy said, running his fingers along what appeared to be solid planking near the boat's bow. It's the same wood, but it doesn't ring the same when I tap it. Jacob examined the area Timothy had identified and realized the boy was right. What looked like a continuation of the hull's natural curve was actually another masterfully concealed compartment. This one sealed so expertly that it had taken months of intimate familiarity with the boat's construction to detect it. The compartment was small but contained what were clearly Hartwell's most personal and precious possessions. Wrapped in silk and protected by multiple layers of oiled leather was a collection of items that told the complete story of Ezra Hartwell's life and the choices that had led him to disappear into history. The first item was a daguerreotype photograph in a silver frame, a formal portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back, in flowing script, was written, "My beloved Catherine, May your face be the last thing I see in this world, and the first in the next. E.H. But it was the second item that made Jacob sink onto his workbench stool in shock. It was a letter written in the same careful handwriting as all the ledger entries. But this one was addressed to "My dear descendants" and dated September 20th, 1869. Just 5 days after Hartwell's final business records, Jacob's. Hands trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper and began to read. To whoever finds this record of my life and failures, I write this knowing that I may never have the chance to make amends for the choices that have led me to this desperate moment. My name is Ezra Hartwell, but I was born Jacob Müller in a simple community where men measured their worth by their character rather than their wealth. I left that community at age 22, convinced that I could build a fortune large enough to prove that I was worthy of Catherine's love and my family's respect. For 26 years, I pursued success with single-minded determination, building an empire that stretched across oceans and accumulated wealth beyond my grandfather's wildest imagination. But success came at a price I never anticipated. In gaining the world's riches, I lost touch with everything that had once made my life meaningful. I became a stranger to the faith that had shaped my youth, to the community values that had formed my character, and ultimately to myself. Catherine waited faithfully for my return, but I was always planning one more voyage, one more business venture that would finally provide the security I convinced myself she deserved. By the time I realized that she had never wanted wealth, she had only wanted me, it was too late. She died while I was in China, completing a trading mission that seemed more important than being at her bedside. Now my enemies circle like wolves, determined to seize what I have built through methods I cannot and will not match, rather than fight them with their own corrupt weapons. I have chosen to hide what I have accumulated and disappear from a world that has corrupted my soul. The maps and records in this vessel will lead the worthy to treasures that could transform countless lives. But I pray that whoever finds them will prove wiser than I was. I hope they will understand that the greatest treasure is not gold or silver, but the love of family and community that I traded away for false promises of worldly success. If you who read this are of my blood, know that you carry the legacy of both my failures and my hopes. Use what I have hidden to restore what truly matters: home, community, faith, and the simple bonds that connect one generation to the next. I go now to seek the forgiveness I do not deserve, carrying nothing but the prayer that some good might yet come from the mistakes that have defined my life. Your ancestor in both blood and regret, Jacob Müller, who became Ezra Hartwell. Jacob read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled in his mind. Ezra Hartwell had been Jacob Müller, a man with essentially the same name who had left an Amish community to seek his fortune in the outside world. The boat, the treasures, the carefully preserved records, they weren't the legacy of a stranger. They were a family inheritance that had taken more than 150 years to find its way home. Timothy, who had been reading over Jacob's shoulder, was the first to break the stunned silence. "Mr. Miller, he's your family. He's actually your ancestor." Jacob nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that had closed his throat. Everything made sense now. The inexplicable connection he'd felt to the boat. The way the restoration had felt more like a calling than a project. The sense that he was meant to find these hidden treasures, but there was more in the compartment. Beneath the letter, Jacob found what appeared to be Hartwell's original Amish Bible, a German-language edition printed in 1820 with Jacob Müller inscribed in careful script on the title page. The pages were worn from use, with verses underlined and margins filled with notes in both German and English. Most revealing of all was a small prayer book, also in German, that had obviously been Hartwell's constant companion during his years at sea. The pages were stained with salt water and marked with the wear that came from desperate use during storms and lonely nights. Pressed between its pages were dried flowers that might have been from Catherine's garden, preserved like memories of a simpler time. Timothy helped Jacob spread all the artifacts across his workbench: compass, ledger, pocket watch, gold coins, maritime charts, photograph, letter, Bible, and prayer book. Together, they told the complete story of a man who had gained everything the world offered, but lost everything that truly mattered. "He was trying to come home," Jacob said softly, understanding finally flooding through him. All those years of building his fortune, all the careful planning and hiding of treasures, he was trying to find a way to come back to the community he'd abandoned. Sarah arrived with their lunch just as Jacob was refolding the letter, and she immediately sensed that something monumental had occurred. "What is it?" she asked, studying their expressions. "What have you found?" Jacob showed her the letter and watched as she read it with growing amazement. When she finished, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Jacob, this man was your great-great-grandfather. This boat, these treasures, they're not some stranger's legacy. They're your inheritance." The discovery recontextualized everything that had happened over the past months. Jacob's inexplicable attraction to the boat, his persistence in the face of community ridicule, even the boat's arrival at his farm, none of it had been coincidence. Somehow, across the decades, Jacob Miller's final wish was being fulfilled. His treasures had found their way back to the family and community he had spent his final years trying to reach. But with understanding came an even greater burden of responsibility. Hartwell's letter made clear that the treasures were meant to restore what truly matters: home, community, faith, and the simple bonds that connect one generation to the next. The money wasn't just Jacob's to do with as he pleased. It carried the weight of an ancestor's regret and the hope for redemption that had never been fulfilled. As Jacob studied the prayer book that had sustained his great-great-grandfather through years of spiritual exile, he felt the full weight of the choice that now confronted him. Hartwell had learned too late that worldly success couldn't fill the emptiness left by abandoning one's true home. Now Jacob had the opportunity to use Hartwell's accumulated wealth to strengthen the very community values that his ancestor had traded away. The question was whether Jacob had the wisdom to succeed where his great-great-grandfather had failed, to use worldly treasure in service of spiritual wealth rather than letting it become a substitute for what truly mattered. Outside the barn, snow continued to fall, covering the familiar landscape of Lancaster County in pristine white that reminded Jacob of the fresh start his ancestor had never lived to claim. The deed changed everything. Jacob discovered it the day after finding Hartwell's letter, tucked inside the German prayer book between pages that contained his ancestors' handwritten pleas for forgiveness and guidance. The document was more than just another piece of the puzzle. It was the solution to problems Jacob hadn't even known existed. The legal papers, dated September 18, 1869, and filed in the Pennsylvania State Archives, documented Ezra Hartwell's purchase of 2,247 acres of prime Lancaster County farmland. The property description matched exactly the area where Jacob's community had been struggling to maintain their foothold for generations. Land that was now owned by English developers who had been threatening eviction for months. Dr. Morrison's verification of the document's authenticity came with news that stunned even her professional composure. The deed was still legally valid, making Jacob the rightful heir to property worth millions of dollars in today's market. But more importantly for the community, it meant that the land they had farmed and called home for 4 generations couldn't be sold out from under them by outside developers. "Mr. Miller, do you understand what this means?" Dr. Morrison asked, her usual scholarly calm replaced by barely contained excitement. "Your ancestor purchased this land specifically to create a sanctuary for his community. According to the deed's provisions, it was to be held in perpetual trust for the simple people who value faith above fortune." Jacob sat in his kitchen, the deed spread before him on the same table where his family had shared countless meals, and tried to process the magnitude of what his great-great-grandfather had accomplished. Even in his final, desperate months, Hartwell had been working to secure a future for the community he'd never managed to rejoin. But the discovery came at a crucial moment. The current landowners, a development company from Philadelphia, had issued final eviction notices to 7 Amish families, including Jacob's own neighbors. The company planned to build a shopping complex and housing development on land that had been farmed continuously since the 1840s. The community faced dispersal unless they could somehow raise the money to purchase the property at market prices, an impossible sum for people who measured wealth in livestock and good harvests rather than bank accounts. Timothy arrived as Jacob was studying the deed for the 20th time, trying to understand all the legal implications. "Mr. Miller, did you hear about the Yoder family? They got their final notice yesterday. They have to be off their land by the end of the month." Jacob's chest tightened. Samuel Yoder might be overly curious about his neighbor's business, but he was also a good man with 6 children and elderly parents to care for. The thought of the family being forced from land their grandfather had cleared with his own hands was almost unbearable. "Timothy, what if I told you that all of this, the evictions, the development plans, all of it, could be stopped?" The boy's eyes widened. "How?" Jacob showed him the deed, watching as Timothy's young mind worked through the implications. "This means you own all the land they're trying to develop? It means my great-great-grandfather bought it specifically to protect our community. He knew what would happen if the land fell into the wrong hands, and he tried to prevent it more than 150 years ago." Over the following days, Jacob found himself carrying a burden heavier than any physical labor he'd ever undertaken. The deed gave him the power to save his community, but exercising that power would mean revealing secrets he'd kept hidden for months. It would mean explaining about the boat, the treasures, and his connection to Ezra Hartwell, explanations that might be met with suspicion or accusations of fraud. Sarah watched him wrestle with the decision, offering counsel when asked, but understanding that this was a choice Jacob had to make for himself. "Your ancestor spent his life trying to find his way back to what mattered," she said one evening as they sat by their kitchen fire. "Maybe this is his way of completing that journey through you." The crisis came to a head on a bitter December morning when Jacob arrived at his barn to find Samuel Yoder waiting for him, holding an envelope with the unmistakable look of legal documentation. "Jacob, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Samuel said, his usual stern manner softened by obvious distress. "There are rumors going around about your boat project, about things you might have found. Some people think you've been hiding something important from the community." Jacob looked at his neighbor, a man he'd known for 40 years, whose family faced homelessness in 3 weeks, and made his decision. "Samuel, what I'm about to show you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me and listen to the whole story before you make any judgments." He led Samuel into the barn and began with the compass, explaining how each discovery had led to the next, how the artifacts had told the story of Ezra Hartwell's rise and fall, and how the final revelations had connected everything to their own community's history. Samuel examined each artifact with the careful attention of a man accustomed to evaluating the quality of craftsmanship. When Jacob showed him the deed, Samuel's hands began to shake. "Jacob, this document says you own the very land we're about to be evicted from. It says my great-great-grandfather bought it to protect people like us. And if it's legally valid, then those eviction notices aren't worth the paper they're printed on." Samuel was quiet for a long time, studying the deed and the other artifacts, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been awe. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure what it all meant, and because I was afraid of what wealth might do to our community. My ancestor's letter makes it clear that the pursuit of money corrupted his soul and cost him everything he truly valued." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding the dilemma Jacob had been facing. But keeping it secret won't help the families who are about to lose their homes. "I know. That's why I'm telling you now. Samuel, I need your help deciding how to present this to the community in a way that brings us together rather than dividing us. They spent the morning developing a plan that would reveal Jacob's discoveries gradually, allowing people to process each revelation before moving to the next. Samuel agreed to arrange a community meeting under the pretense of discussing the eviction crisis, giving Jacob the opportunity to present his solution without appearing to show off or claim special status. But as they prepared for what would be the most important gathering in their community's recent history, Jacob found himself thinking about Hartwell's warning in his letter. His ancestor had accumulated vast wealth, but had lost the ability to enjoy simple pleasures, to find satisfaction in honest work, to maintain the relationships that made life meaningful. The treasures Jacob had discovered could transform their community, but they could just as easily destroy it if not handled with wisdom and humility. The challenge wasn't just revealing the secret, it was ensuring that worldly wealth served spiritual values rather than replacing them. Dr. Morrison arrived that afternoon with the final verification Jacob had been waiting for, legal confirmation that the deed was authentic and enforceable, and an assessment of the total treasure value that exceeded even their most optimistic estimates. Mr. Miller, based on the maritime charts alone, I estimate the total hidden wealth at somewhere between $80 and $120 million, she said. Her voice hushed with the magnitude of the figure. Even if only half the cache sites are still accessible, we're talking about one of the largest treasure recoveries in American history. Jacob felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. $100 million could transform not just his community, but the entire county. It could fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that would benefit thousands of people. But it could also attract attention, bringing reporters, treasure hunters, and government officials who might fundamentally change the quiet, simple life his people had worked so hard to preserve. As evening approached and the community meeting drew near, Jacob stood in his barn, surrounded by artifacts that told the story of one man's spiritual journey, from simple faith through worldly success and back toward the hope of redemption. The boat that had started as a simple restoration project had become the vessel carrying his great-great-grandfather's final gift, not just material wealth, but the chance to succeed where Hartwell had failed. Tomorrow, Jacob would place that gift before his community and trust them to choose wisely. The community gathering took place in the Yoder family's largest barn on a December evening when snow fell steadily outside and the warmth of shared concern filled the air inside. Nearly 60 adults from 7 families had come together to discuss what many believed would be their final week as a unified community. The eviction notices had created a crisis that threatened to scatter people who had lived as neighbors for generations. Jacob sat near the back with Sarah and Timothy, the weight of Hartwell's prayer book heavy in his coat pocket. He'd brought the worn German volume as a reminder of his ancestors' spiritual journey, a tangible connection to the man whose choices had led to this moment of reckoning. Samuel Yoder called the meeting to order, with the gravity appropriate to their circumstances. Friends, we've come together tonight to face the hardest decision our community has confronted in living memory. The developers have made their final offer: accept their buyout terms or face legal eviction within the week. We must decide whether to scatter to new communities or try to raise money. We don't have to purchase land that's been our home for generations. Murmurs of concern rippled through the gathered families. Benjamin Stoltzfus spoke for many when he said, "Samuel, we've been over the numbers a dozen times. Even selling everything we own, we couldn't raise a fraction of what they're asking." "Unless the Lord provides a miracle," added Martha Yoder, Samuel's wife, "we'll be loading wagons by Christmas." Jacob felt Timothy's encouraging squeeze on his arm. The moment had arrived to reveal secrets that would either unite the community in hope or divide it with suspicion and conflict. "Actually," Jacob said, rising slowly from his seat, I believe the Lord may have already provided that miracle. The barn fell silent, except for the soft sound of snow against the windows. Every face turned toward Jacob with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Thomas Brennan, who sat near the front, wore the kind of frown that suggested he suspected another of Jacob's foolish notions. "Jacob Miller," Samuel said carefully, "do you have something to share with us?" Jacob reached into his coat and withdrew Hartwell's prayer book, holding it so everyone could see the worn German binding. "This belonged to my great-great-grandfather, a man named Jacob Müller, who left our community more than 150 years ago to seek his fortune in the outside world." He opened the prayer book to reveal the pressed flowers Catherine had given Hartwell. Their colors faded but still recognizable as forget-me-nots. He became very wealthy, but in gaining the world's riches, he lost his soul. By the time he realized his mistake, the woman he loved had died, and his enemies were closing in to steal what he'd built. Jacob paused, letting the story settle before continuing. Rather than fight corruption with corruption, he chose to hide his fortune and try to return to the community he'd abandoned. He never made it home, but he left behind maps and records that would allow his family to find what he'd hidden. Thomas Brennan stood up with obvious impatience. "Jacob, we don't have time for old family stories. We're facing eviction in 6 days. I know exactly how long we have, Thomas. Because I also know why we won't be evicted." Jacob pulled the deed from his coat, the legal document that had been hidden in his ancestors' prayer book for more than a century and a half. Jacob Müller, who called himself Ezra Hartwell in the outside world, purchased this land, all of this land, in 1869. He bought 2,147 acres specifically to create a sanctuary for the simple people who value faith above fortune. The silence that followed was profound. Jacob could hear his own heartbeat, could see the shock and disbelief written across every face in the barn. Dr. Morrison, who had been waiting outside as Jacob had requested, entered the barn carrying a leather portfolio. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison," Jacob said. "She's an expert in historical documents, and I've asked her to verify what I'm telling you." Dr. Morrison approached with the professional composure that had served her well during decades of handling priceless artifacts. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent weeks authenticating the documents Mr. Miller discovered. The deed is genuine, filed with the Pennsylvania State Archives on September 18, 1869. According to state law, it gives Mr. Miller clear legal title to the property you're threatened with losing." The murmurs that arose were not of joy, but of confusion and concern. Benjamin Stoltzfus voiced what many were thinking. "Jacob, even if this is true, where did you find these documents? How long have you been hiding this from us?" Jacob had expected this question and had prepared his answer carefully. "I found them hidden in an old boat I've been restoring. The same boat that many of you told me was worthless junk. My ancestor hid these records where only someone with patience and faith would find them." He gestured toward Timothy, who had become his steadfast ally in unraveling the mystery. "Timothy here helped me understand what we'd discovered. Every artifact told part of the story of a man who gained everything the world offered, but lost everything that truly mattered." Martha Yoder asked the question that cut to the heart of everyone's concerns. "Jacob, what do you intend to do with this knowledge? Do you plan to become our landlord?" Jacob had spent sleepless nights wrestling with this very question. The power the deed gave him was extraordinary, but exercising it wrongly could destroy the community he was trying to save. "I intend to do what Jacob Müller wished he could have done, use worldly wealth to strengthen rather than weaken the bonds that hold us together." Samuel Yoder studied the deed Dr. Morrison had placed on the makeshift podium, his expression thoughtful rather than incredulous. "Jacob, you're asking us to believe that your ancestor foresaw this exact situation more than 150 years ago and took steps to prevent it. I'm asking you to believe that God works through human hearts across generations to accomplish his purposes," Jacob replied. "My ancestor made terrible choices in pursuing wealth, but he spent his final years trying to make amends. This deed, these records, they're his attempt to complete a journey home that death prevented him from finishing. Thomas Brennan remained skeptical. Even if everything you're saying is true, you still haven't explained how you plan to help families who need money for taxes, repairs, and basic necessities. A piece of paper, however old, doesn't put food on tables. Jacob smiled, understanding that Thomas had unknowingly provided the perfect opening for the revelation that would truly test their community's wisdom and faith. Thomas, you're absolutely right that a piece of paper doesn't put food on tables, Jacob said, reaching into Dr. Morrison's portfolio and withdrawing a folder that contained the legal documentation they'd spent weeks preparing. But this might help with those concerns. He opened the folder to reveal modern legal documents bearing the seals of Lancaster County and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. These papers transfer ownership of the 2,847 acres from me to the Lancaster County Amish Community Trust, established specifically to ensure that this land can never again be sold to outside developers. Every family currently farming this property becomes a permanent beneficiary, with rights that pass to their children and grandchildren in perpetuity. The gasps that arose were audible throughout the barn. Sarah reached for Jacob's hand, her eyes bright with tears of pride and relief. Dr. Morrison stepped forward to explain the legal implications. Ladies and gentlemen, what Mr. Miller has created is essentially a community land trust that protects your homes and farms forever. The trust owns the property, but you retain all farming and residence rights. Most importantly, the trust agreement specifically prohibits any sale or development that would compromise your way of life. Samuel, Yoder examined the trust documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that legal papers could mean the difference between security and displacement. Jacob, this is extraordinary. But I have to ask, how did you pay for the legal work to establish this trust? These kinds of documents must have cost thousands of dollars. Jacob had been waiting for this question, knowing it would lead to the revelation that would truly test his community's wisdom. Samuel, the boat contained more than just maps and deeds. My ancestor hid portions of his fortune in carefully marked locations all along the eastern seaboard. Dr. Morrison has verified that the recoverable assets are worth somewhere between $80 and $120 million. The silence that followed was so complete that Jacob could hear the wind whistling through gaps in the barn walls. $120 million was a sum so vast that most of the people present had no frame of reference for comprehending it. It was Martha Yoder who finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob Miller, are you telling us that you're worth more than $100 million? I'm telling you that Jacob Miller's hidden treasure belongs to the community he abandoned and spent his final years trying to help. The money isn't mine. It's ours, held in trust for the purpose he intended, strengthening the bonds that connect one generation to the next. Benjamin Stoltzfus stood up, his expression troubled rather than joyful. Jacob, that much money would change everything about who we are. How do we remain simple people when we're sitting on a fortune that could buy half the county? Jacob had wrestled with this exact concern through countless sleepless nights. Benjamin, that's why the treasure remains in trust, managed by people we choose rather than controlled by any individual. The money serves the community rather than the community serving the money. Thomas Brennan's skepticism finally gave way to amazement as the full implications settled in his mind. You could have kept all of this for yourself. You could have been the richest man in Pennsylvania, and instead you're giving it away to neighbors who mocked you for working on a rotting boat. Thomas, my ancestor's letter makes clear what happens when a man chooses wealth over community. Jacob Miller gained the whole world and lost his soul in the process. I've seen what truly matters, and it isn't measured in bank accounts. Dr. Morrison provided the final confirmation that transformed theoretical wealth into practical reality. The first cash recovery has already been completed, she announced. Based on one of the maritime charts, We located a sealed container buried on privately owned land near the Chesapeake Bay. The contents, primarily gold coins and precious stones, were valued at just over $2 million. Those assets have been liquidated to fund the land trust and provide the initial operating capital for community projects. Samuel Yoder looked around the barn at his neighbors and friends, his expression showing the weight of responsibility that came with such unprecedented abundance. Jacob, what you're proposing goes beyond anything our community has ever faced. We'll need to pray about this, discuss it thoroughly, and make sure we're not letting material wealth compromise our spiritual foundations. I wouldn't expect anything less, Jacob replied. But Samuel, while we're praying and discussing, our neighbors won't be facing eviction. The land is secure, and we have time to make thoughtful decisions about how to use Jakob Müller's legacy wisely. Elder Isaac Schrock, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke with the authority that came from 7 decades of life experience. Jacob Müller, do you swear before this community and before God that everything you've told us tonight is true? Jacob looked around the barn at faces that had been part of his entire adult life, people who had shared joys and sorrows, celebrated births and mourned deaths, worked together through countless harvests, and endured through difficult winters. I swear it, Isaac, on my father's memory and on the hope of seeing him again. Everything I've told you is true. The old man nodded slowly, his weathered features showing acceptance rather than doubt. Then God has indeed worked a miracle among us, and we must prove worthy of the trust he has placed in our hands. 6 months later, on a warm June morning, when the fields of Lancaster County stretched green and gold toward distant hills, Jacob Müller stood in his expanded workshop, putting the finishing touches on a hand-carved wooden sign. The workshop itself had grown to accommodate not just his own projects, but also the teaching space where Timothy Byler and 3 other young men from the community learned traditional woodworking, techniques that connected them to generations of craftsmen. The sign Jacob was completing bore simple but meaningful words. Hartwell Settlement, founded 1723, restored 2024, where faith and community endure. Below the text, he had carved the image of a small boat riding calm waters, with compass roses in each corner to represent the navigation that had brought Jakob Müller's legacy home at last. Mr. Miller, that's beautiful work, Timothy said, running his fingers along the smooth edges Jacob had shaped with the same wood plane his father had made more than 80 years ago. Where will you mount it? At the entrance to the settlement, where the main road meets our property line, Jacob replied, stepping back to admire the young man's own project, a scaled model of Hartwell's boat that Timothy had been crafting as both a learning exercise and a memorial to the vessel that had changed their lives. The boat itself now stood in a place of honor in the center of their community, fully restored and permanently mounted in a small pavilion that also housed the artifacts that had told Jakob Müller's story. Dr. Morrison visited monthly to help maintain the display and to continue researching the historical significance of Hartwell's maritime empire. The pavilion had become a gathering place where children learned about their community's extraordinary history, and adults found reminders of the values that wealth should serve rather than replace. Through the workshop's open door, Jacob could see Sarah tending her expanded garden, where vegetables now grew in abundance on soil that would never again be threatened by outside development. The Lancaster County Amish community trust had proven to be more than just a legal protection. It had become a model for other communities facing similar pressures from developers and land speculators. The trust's management committee, elected by the families it served, had made careful decisions about how to use the resources Jakob Müller's treasure had provided, rather than individual distributions that might have created inequality and resentment. They had focused on projects that strengthened the entire community. A new school had been built, using traditional construction methods but incorporating modern safety features. Medical care was now available through a clinic staffed by doctors who respected Amish values while providing contemporary treatment options. The community's young people no longer faced the choice between staying home in poverty or leaving to find economic opportunity elsewhere. Most importantly, the settlement had become financially self-sustaining. The careful investment of treasure assets provided steady income that funded community needs while preserving the principle for future generations. Jacob Müller's fortune had been transformed from personal wealth into community security. Dr. Morrison arrived as Jacob was applying the final coat of protective finish to the settlement sign. She had become not just a professional advisor, but a trusted friend whose expertise had helped them navigate the complex legal and financial challenges that came with managing such extraordinary assets. "Jacob, I have wonderful news," she said, carrying a thick folder that suggested significant developments. The Maritime Museum in Boston wants to create a permanent exhibition about Ezra Hartwell's story. They're particularly interested in how the treasure recovery has been used to strengthen community values rather than compromise them. Jacob smiled, remembering how terrified he had once been, that outside attention might disrupt their simple way of life. But the story of Jacob Müller's redemption through his descendants had inspired people far beyond Lancaster County, demonstrating that wealth and wisdom could coexist when guided by proper priorities. "They want to focus on the lesson your ancestors' story teaches," Dr. Morrison continued. "How the pursuit of material success without spiritual grounding leads to emptiness, but how wealth can be redeemed when it serves love rather than pride." Timothy looked up from his boat model, his young face bright with understanding that came from months of reflecting on Jacob Müller's journey. "Mr. Miller, do you think your ancestor would be proud of what we've done with his treasure?" Jacob considered the question while watching Sarah harvest vegetables that would feed not just their family, but several neighbors whose own gardens had struggled in the spring drought. The community's prosperity was measured not in individual bank accounts, but in shared abundance and mutual support. "Timothy, I think Jacob Müller would be grateful that his mistakes led to something good." His letter talked about hoping that someone would prove wiser than he was. "And I believe this community has done exactly that." As evening approached and the day's work came to a close, Jacob walked to the pavilion where Hartwell's boat rested under its protective roof. The vessel that had been dismissed as worthless junk now served as a reminder that treasures often hide beneath appearances, that patience and faith can reveal extraordinary possibilities. In the most unlikely places, he pulled out the brass compass that had started his journey into his ancestors' story and watched as its needle pointed steadily north, as reliable as the day it was made. The inscription around its base, "E. Hartwell, Master of the Seas, 1847, no longer seemed like the boast of a proud merchant, but like the prayer of a man who had finally learned to navigate by stars more constant than material success. The compass had guided Jacob Müller's ships across dangerous waters for decades, but in the end, it had served a more important purpose. It had helped guide his treasure home to the community he had never stopped loving, even when he had lost his way. As Jacob walked back toward his house, where Sarah was lighting the oil lamps that would welcome him home, he reflected on the truth his great-great-grandfather had learned too late, but had still managed to preserve for future generations. The greatest treasures in life couldn't be bought or sold, hoarded or stolen. They were found in shared meals and mutual support, in children learning from elders, in communities that chose to face challenges together rather than scatter when times became difficult. Jacob Müller's gold had been transformed into something far more valuable, a legacy of wisdom that would guide generations yet to come, ensuring that his descendants would never have to choose between prosperity and home the way he had. The boat had finally completed its journey, carrying its precious cargo safely to the harbor where it had always belonged.